So no, there's a difference between being vastly outnumbered but still fighting, on the one hand, and having surrendered for the sake of the status quo and then rationalizing what you did after the surrender. The latter happened because Rabshakeh rode up to our walls and he taunted us and hurt our feelings. Introduction. I was in a recent discussion with Dr. Vishal Mangalwadi, and he used a phrase that hit me with some force. He said that American Christianity was quote-unquote a defeated religion. That discussion can be found at the bottom of this post if you want to check it out. And of course, there is a sense in which this is not true at all, and could not be true. The gates of Hades, our Lord said, was not going to be able to withstand the onslaught of the church. The long war will eventually be won, and God's praises will be offered up from the rising of the sun to the going down of the same. Malachi 1:11. That includes here in America. But it is in fact a long war, and just because the war will eventually be won does not mean that there can be no defeats. There will be particular defeats in particular battles. Confidence about the outcome of the war does not translate into confidence about the outcome of every single battle, campaign, or front. So in what sense would his observation be right on the money? Because I think it is right on the money. Gideon at the wine vat. When the angel of the Lord came to Gideon, he found him hiding from the Midianites, threshing wheat by the winepress, Judges 6:11. It turned out that this angel might have had a sarcastic streak in him, because when he appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor," Judges 6:12. Good job hiding, by the way. Even I had to hunt around a bit to find you, and I'm an angel. But however much we might notice that Gideon was not exactly being a mighty man of valor at that particular moment, there is one way in which Gideon was vastly superior of the modern Reformed keepers of the big thinks. Gideon was hiding from the Midianites, and he knew that this is what he was doing. Modern evangelicals are hiding from the Midianites also, but they have spun themselves a yarn about it. They have told themselves that this is the way of principled pluralism. This is the price we pay for our liberty. If we want the liberty to make money, we also have to support the Midianites' right to seize it. That is how the secular public square works. It is what the founders would have wanted. Now, it is one thing to be forced to pay tribute to the pagans, knowing it to be such, and quite another thing to be forced to pay tribute to them while telling yourself that this is the cost of living in a free society, and is therefore to be reckoned as our fair share. It is to be considered the price of having a quote-unquote good testimony. Having a good testimony is handing over your wheat crop winsomely. So the two ways are quite distinct, hiding from the pagans and hiding from the pagans while rationalizing. Hermetically sealed compartments in the soul. In order to hide, just like Gideon was doing, while convincing yourself that this is not at all what you are doing, a certain configuration of the mind and heart becomes necessary. And that configuration is not healthy or integrated at all. Whatever we say about principled pluralism, in order to make it work inside the Christian mind, it is closer to principled schizophrenia. The Anabaptist says that he is not going to bear the sword, that it is not lawful for him to bear the sword, and so he is going to go out into the countryside of eastern Pennsylvania in order to drive a plow instead. This is an error, but consistent. The modern Reformed advocate of the Reformed variant of this, R2K and such like, has to do all the withdrawing inside of his own head. Not only does he withdraw from the world inside his own head, he also manages to remain in the world inside his own head. And on top of that, he remains in the world out there in the world too. He is playing tag with the devil, and base is this cluster of exemption thoughts inside his head. Whenever he's about to be tagged by some sprite, he grabs base, the tree that we might call the tree of the knowledge that this world is not my home. But this cannot be done unless you have different parts of your soul hermetically sealed off from each other. Stephen Wolfe recently highlighted the absurdities that can result from this. Unlike the Anabaptist, the R2K position would hold that it is lawful for a Christian to become a magistrate, and indeed lawful for him to become a chief magistrate. In this position, together with the other lawful magistrates, he could declare war, conscript citizens for that war, direct the conduct of that war, determine to use nuclear weapons, decide the terms of surrender, and so forth. Momentous decisions, in other words. Because these R2K men are not Anabaptists, they would think that all of this is legit. But then they would also say that this magistrate could not decide that the citizens of his country needed to take Sunday off because it was the Lord's Day. That would be way beyond the limit and an example of ecclesiastical tyranny. Thus far, Wolfe's objection. But there's another problem with this as well. All the activities he's conducting as a magistrate need to be sealed off from the part of his brain that believes that Jesus rose from the dead. Deciding whether or not to use nukes has to be decided on the basis of the Noahic covenant and natural law. The part of him that is making all these decisions cannot in any way be informed by or even remember what he was reading in Deuteronomy that morning. If he gathers any wisdom from that source, he's an aspiring Ayatollah. But of course, as we shall see in a minute, if magistrates are not under the revealed law of God, what could possibly be wrong in becoming an aspiring Ayatollah? Which brings us to Darrell Hart. Darrell Hart believes that Christians should disobey the magistrate if the magistrate requires them to disobey God. So far, so good. But, however, quote, Nero did not violate God's law if he executed Christians who obeyed God rather than man. If Paul continued to preach after the emperor said he may not, then Nero was doing what God ordained government to do. Christians don't get a pass from civil law just because they follow a higher law. DGH. Hart holds that when it comes down to the pinch, Christians should disobey, but they should also be willing to take their lumps. Quote, if a law is unjust or if we must obey God rather than men, then we suffer the consequences of disobedience. That's what the apostles did. They didn't form political action committees to overturn Roman laws. DGH. Sure, they didn't form pacts to overturn Roman laws. They had better things to do, like disobeying the Roman laws. And as the church grew in authority and influence, because God was blessing their disobedience, a time eventually came when the emperors had to acknowledge that this isn't working. Now, Hart's position, as stated above, would require that Constantine's decision to stop persecuting Christians was a matter of common prudence and not a moral decision at all. It would have been lawful to continue persecuting them, and it was lawful to stop if he wanted. He was in charge and so could go either way. But if that is the case, then it would be also entirely lawful for him to start persecuting pagans, right? And then it would be their turn to start taking it in the teeth. Incidentally, I'm not saying anything about what the historical Constantine did or didn't do. We're just using him as a handy tool for illustration. To anchor the point, let us talk about Daniel in a different empire. Let us talk about what Darius did after God delivered Daniel from the lion's den. And the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives. And the lions had the mastery of them, and brake all their bones in pieces, or ever they came to the bottom of the den. Daniel 6:24. According to Hart, this was entirely copacetic as well, because Darius was in charge of the lion's den. Daniel disobeyed, and so in accordance with the law, he had to go to the lions. The men who schemed against Daniel displeased the king, and so they needed to suffer the consequences of that displeasure. We all should watch this with equanimity because Romans 13. According to Hart, if it is lawful to punish Christians for breaking the law, even if the law is a pagan law, then it would also be lawful to punish pagans for breaking the law, even if the law is a Christian law. So then, so far from providing an alternative to Christian nationalism, Hart has actually provided us with a rationale for a Christian nationalism with no breaks. Quote, if I break the civil law, I should be punished. God gave us authorities to uphold the law and maintain order and peace. It's disorderly and unpeaceful if you think you can pick and choose which laws to obey because you have Jesus in your heart. DGH. But if we don't get to pick and choose just because we have Jesus in our hearts, then the secularists don't get to pick and choose just because they have James Madison in their hearts. We all need to do as we're told, right? Or suffer the consequences, right? And all of this can be reduced to higher levels of absurdity in just minutes. If it's lawful for Nero to execute Christians for disobeying the law, and if it is lawful for Christians to hold office under an emperor like Nero, then what happens when Nero does not violate God's law in ordering the execution of a preacher who would not stop preaching? The preacher was also not violating God's law because he was willing to take the punishment. But when Nero gives the order, he gives the order to some functionary, and it is lawful for Christians to hold office among those functionaries. So let us say a Christian is the director of Nero's Bureau of Prisons, a lawful vocation. What does he do when Nero says, like Herod did when that girl danced for him, bring me the head of that preacher on a platter? The preacher is an elder in this functionary's church. Nero is not breaking God's law by killing a Christian preacher. The preacher is not breaking God's law because he's willing to sacrifice his life in order to obey God. The emperor gives the director of prisons a lawful order, and Darrell Hart has assured him that Nero is not out of line for issuing the order. So is this man out of line for executing his own pastor? Because his pastor continued to preach the gospel. If not, why not? If so, then why? As Joe Biden could say, come on, man, the glory of limited government. I think I may have figured out why a number of Christians are so freaked out about Christian nationalism. I said above that Hart's position allows for a Christian nationalism without any breaks. But this is not because of anything inherent in the positions of Christian nationalism. It is because Hart himself is a statist. This is because of something inherent in his view of the power of the state. He believes that Nero has the rightful authority to ban the preaching of the gospel. Such monstrous folly would be within his purview. But if something like that is under his authority, what wouldn't be under his authority? So all of this is because Hart is a statist and believes that the state has no brakes. That being the case, he thinks that certain drivers that he would consider poor drivers should not be allowed to get behind the wheel. But that's just a personal opinion of Hart's and not a principial conviction. Other people think that Christians would be totally within their rights to summon up a Protestant Franco. Relax, it'll be totally great. So if such Christians gain control of that state beast, then we should all invite Katie, as they say, to bar the door. But actually, Christian nationalists don't want to seize control of the state beast as it now is. Christian nationalists want to get the state back within its assigned limits. A central feature of Christian political theory is the glory of limited government. Think of it as theocratic classical liberalism. And yes, this is a Puritan koan. Theology as rationalization. So the Christian faith in North America is currently a defeated religion because we have rationalized our marginal status in a country that we built. This is nothing short of a staggering loss of faith. We have numerous theological traditions and theologians who are adept at rationalizing the condition we are in. This is handy because if the condition we are in can be successfully rationalized, then we need not be troubled to do anything about it. But what can be said to the objection that you Christian nationalists are part of this, right? We are in North America, and so we are part of this defeated religion, correct? No, not exactly. It is true that we are all living under the same conditions. David French, Russell Moore, John Piper, Eric Metaxas, Stephen Wolfe, Joe Rigney, Scott Aniol, Jared Longshore, Al Mohler, et al. All of us went through 4 years of Biden and are now in the midst of the Trump recoil. We are all dealing with the same situation on the ground. We are therefore all in the same boat. So no, there's a difference between being vastly outnumbered but still fighting, on the one hand, and having surrendered for the sake of the status quo and then rationalizing what you did after the surrender. The latter happened because Rabshakeh rode up to our walls and he taunted us and hurt our feelings. Hearken not to Hezekiah, for thus saith the king of Assyria, make an agreement with me by a present, and come out to me, and then eat ye every man of his own vine, and every one of his fig tree, and drink ye every one of the waters of his cistern. 2 Kings 18:31. After so many evangelicals accepted the deal, it was necessary to develop a theology that would not spend so much time jabbing at our conscience at 2 in the morning. And so that is what we did. So there it is. Christ assumed responsibility for things he didn't do, taking them all upon himself. What should husbands therefore do? They should take responsibility for the state of their marriage. Over many years of counseling and teaching, I've discovered that one of the most difficult lessons for men to learn is the distinction between guilt and responsibility. I believe that this is a difficult lesson for any man to learn in this fallen world, but our egalitarian generation has made it many times more difficult. This has been done through its resentful revolt against masculinity itself, coupled with its signature reflex move of routinely blaming the man. After a few years of being blamed for everything, it is not surprising that a manosphere began to take shape. Some of that was within the normal range of human reactions, making Jordan Peterson popular, while some of it was kind of out there. You think masculinity is toxic? I'll show you toxic, making Andrew Tate popular. Given that some have taken my teaching on a man's responsibility as being simply a pious variant of blame the man, I thought it best to dedicate this one blog post as something of an explainer. This is what I mean, and just as important, what I do not mean. Sometimes the guilty party is also the responsible party, and so everything seems pretty straightforward to everyone. But there are other situations where the guilty party is not the responsible party, and this is where the lesson lies. For the former instance, suppose a man gets falling down drunk, climbs into his car, then gets in an accident, and a number of innocent people are killed. In such a case, we can use who was guilty and who was responsible as interchangeable questions. We are asking the same thing, which is, who did it? But here's an illustration of an occasion where they are not interchangeable. Suppose a man purchases a business from another man, and the seller, through a series of legal but unethical maneuvers, manages to hide from the buyer the fact that there's about $50,000 owed to various other parties. Who is guilty? The seller. Who is responsible? The buyer. He now owns those obligations. Suppose a sailor manning the helm in the middle of the night disregards the orders that the navigator left with him and runs the ship aground. Who is guilty? That sailor is. Who is responsible? Whose head is on the admiral's desk the following day? The captain's. And why? The sailor is guilty, but the captain is responsible. And this is how God made the world. Responsibility flows upward. This is how it ought to be. Because we live in an individualistic age, we want to ensure that we not be saddled with the consequences of anyone else's misbehavior. I just said we live in an individualistic age, but another way of saying this is that we live in an anti-covenantal age. This is because covenants necessitate robust interaction when it comes to guilt and responsibility, and an intelligent grasp of covenants requires that we mark and understand the difference. The great Job exhibited this mentality in a wonderful way. After his grown children had finished a course of celebratory feasting, what did Job do? Quote, "And it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning, and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, It may be that my sons have sinned, and cursed God in their hearts. Thus did Job continually." Job 1:5. We should not only take note of what Job did, but we should also consider how he is praised in the text for this mentality. Thus did Job continually. And 3 verses later, Jehovah is bragging on Job to Satan, none like him in the earth, perfect and upright, verse 8. And what was Job doing just before this? He was taking responsibility for something that one of his sons or daughters might have done in their hearts. These grown children might have cursed God silently in their hearts, and so their father offered burnt offerings, according to the number of them all. What kind of man does this? Here's the beginning of a quick answer if we want to start narrowing it down. Not 21st century man, not 20th century man. Job was a covenant man, and he knew how covenants work. Marriages and families are much more than the sum total of the individuals involved. There is a corporate reality that ties them all together, and when one part of that body hurts, the whole body does. When one part is shamed, the whole is shamed. Quote, "He that gathereth in summer is a wise son, but he that sleepeth in harvest is a son that causeth shame." Proverbs 10:5. "A wise servant shall have rule over a son that causeth shame, and shall have part of the inheritance among the brethren." Proverbs 17:2. "He that wasteth his father and chaseth away his mother is a son that causeth shame, and bringeth reproach." Proverbs 19:26. "The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself bringeth his mother to shame." Proverbs 29:15. A father who's ashamed of a lazy son, for example, is ashamed because he himself is aware of the standard. He knows what hard work is. He is ashamed of his son's behavior not because he shares the guilt, but rather precisely because he doesn't share the guilt. But just because he is not guilty doesn't mean that he's not responsible. And why is he responsible? Because he is the covenant head. He is the father. The reason we kick against this is because individualism has seeped deep into our bones. It doesn't seem fair that a man can be held responsible for the guilt that someone else incurred. But the reason it doesn't seem fair is because it isn't. It is covenant unity. Is it fair that when I cut my hand, my whole body has a difficult time of it? No, but that is just how bodies work. Now, the feminist wants to blame the man as a device that enables her to challenge his authority in the home. Mark this. Blaming the man is an exercise in taking the man down a few notches. But urging men to take responsibility is an exercise in establishing the man's authority in the home. This is because, as I have argued for years, authority flows to those who take responsibility. Authority flees those who seek to escape or evade responsibility. And this brings us to the ultimate example. I could have begun with this, but I actually wanted to build up to it. The Christian faith has an absolute center, and that center is the crucifixion of the Lord Jesus. When he was crucified, what was he doing? He was taking responsibility for sins he did not commit. He was not guilty of any of those sins, but he bore the responsibility for them. This is set before us in Scripture as the greatest act of love that human history knows, and that act of love was one of taking responsibility. Quote, "For Christ also hath once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit." 1 Peter 3:18. The just for the unjust. And so here's the final point. Husbands are commanded to love their wives, imitating the Lord Jesus at just this point. Of course, as I never tire of saying, no fallen husband can duplicate what Jesus did. But whether we can duplicate it or not, we are commanded to imitate it. And what are we imitating? We are not just imitating a willingness to die for the sake of another person, although that would certainly be included, John 15:13. We are commanded to be willing to be held responsible for things we didn't do. The second Adam did what the first Adam did not do. When Eve ate the fruit and offered it to Adam, what should he have done? Two things. First, he should have refused the fruit. And second, when the Lord came down to walk in the garden in the cool of the day, Adam should have sought him out and said, "Take me instead." We know he should have done this because that is what the final Adam did do. He turned to the Father and said, "Take me instead." Husbands, love your wives that way. So there it is. Christ assumed responsibility for things he didn't do, taking them all upon himself. What should husbands therefore do? They should take responsibility for the state of their marriage. And if you immediately translate this into a statement that makes the man out to be blamed, then you have slipped off the point. Many times the man is the guilty one, but whether or not he is guilty, he is always the responsible one. And why? Because he is the husband. So if he does this, we are not blaming him. Rather, we praise him. Authority flows to those who take responsibility. Authority and honor and glory and blessing. But it is very easy for husbands to writhe under this. They live in a generation that blames them for everything, and then the alternative is this? Yes, this is the only alternative. Love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, the just for the unjust. If you complain that this is impossible, then you're merely revealing what you find distasteful and difficult. What? Will you not love your wife the way Moses loved the Israelites? Exodus 32:32. Will you not love your wife the way that Paul loved the Jews? Romans 9:3. Will you not love her as Christ did the church? Ephesians 5:25 and 26. Blah Blah Black Sheep is now available for pre-order. What is Blah Blah Black Sheep, you may ask? A natural question, certainly. It is a book for astute children, written by my son Nate and illustrated by Forrest Dickinson. This is the famous duo of Hello Ninja fame. You know that show on Netflix? Blah Blah Black Sheep never does it right, according to the flock, but who do they call when danger's afoot? Get your copy today at blahblahkids.com. To all the good people of Moscow, greetings. I trust that you all had a wonderful Christmas with your families, and as we are now on the threshold of a new year, I hope to do what I can to brighten the prospect of that year just a little bit. If I were in full possession of an olive branch, I would certainly offer it. But as it turns out, I only have 2 or 3 olive leaves, but what I have, I do want to offer. If you will bear with me for just these few moments, I want to begin on a personal note. I then want to discuss briefly 3 of the bones of contention that exist in our community, perhaps providing additional perspective. And then I want to conclude by giving you all something of a friendly heads up. I helped my parents move here in 1971, just before I went in the Navy. When I got out of the Navy in 1975, I thought that I would attend college at the U of I, catch up with my family and friends, and then move on with whatever I was going to do with my life. But I got married my first year back as a Vandal freshman, and Nancy and I started having kids right away. This is another way of saying that the roots started to go down pretty quickly. Now, I just said that I began living here as a resident in 1975. As the seal of our city states, we were founded as a town in 1887. What this means is that Moscow is 136 years old now, and I've been living here for 48 years of that time. And when I first started living here, Moscow was only 88 years old. Put into a percentage, it means that I've been a resident of Moscow for 35% of its entire history. And I love this town. All 3 of my kids were born at Gritman, and all 18 of my grandkids were born there. My wife and I both graduated from the U of I, and I was even privileged to teach courses for a few years at the U of I as well. I wrote a weekly column for the Daily News for many years, which is how I first learned to type. It was also when I first began exasperating some of you with my Precambrian versions of political theory, but that is another part of the story. Let us not get distracted. Christ Church was also established as a church in the fall of 1975 and has been a thriving, growing church ever since that time. I've been the pastor since 1977. This means that our church and our associated ministries are also an organic fixture in our community. We are not an alien transplant, not at all, but rather are a significant part of what Moscow now means. And it has been this way for decades. I do not say any of this in order to dismay anyone unnecessarily or to taunt, but simply to help us all recognize where we actually are. I can remember when Tri-State was right on the edge of town, and I say this because there's a real sense in which our ministries and our town are growing up together. Our Kirker community is very much native to Moscow. There should be a way for us to figure out how to do this in a more civilized manner. Now, some critics are certainly going to say Psychiana was a fixture also, and this gives us a good jumping-off point for getting into our 3 substantive issues. But before going into that, we believe that Gamaliel spoke good wisdom centuries ago when he counseled the Sanhedrin on a topic very similar to this one. They were dealing with the problems caused by the extraordinary growth of the new Christian movement in Jerusalem shortly after Pentecost. And Gamaliel said this, "And now I say to you, keep away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan or this work is of men, it will come to nothing." Acts 5:38, NKJV. We, naturally enough, believe that what we are experiencing is the blessing of God, but we understand that there are others who would call it something else, a religious fad, or a craze, or an excitement, or cultic mind control. But we don't think of ourselves as an offbeat group like Psychiana. We are more like historic Presbyterians, the kind that believe the Bible. So if it is not a spiritually healthy thing, then let it go the way of Psychiana, leaving just a few trace elements behind. And if it is a spiritually healthy thing, we would like to keep doing what we are doing in order to be a genuine blessing to the outside community. This is what we believe Scripture requires of us, Jeremiah 29:7, and we really are seeking to live out this way of doing things. Now, at this point, some of you are sure to think, well, why aren't you doing it then? And this brings us to our three issues. There are no doubt other issues as well, but these three can serve as representative samples of the kind of challenges we are all facing together. First, are we attempting any kind of a hostile takeover? No, not at all. Are we trying to duplicate what that Rajneeshpuram group did over in Oregon back in the 80s? No, not a bit of it. But if that is the case, then why do we say on our website that we would like Moscow to become a Christian town? This statement was recently highlighted by the Meet the Press segment that was done about us, and so what about that? Or things like that. So I'm going to ask you to make a basic distinction together with me. We are Christians and evangelical, which means that like the Apostle Paul, we desire all men to have a share in what we have been given. Acts 26:29. If we didn't want that, then that would mean that we didn't really believe anything we were claiming to believe. But everything comes down to the way in which this might happen. How might it happen? We want to love and serve our neighbors. We want our people to build businesses that enhance the quality of life for everyone else. We want people to come worship the Lord together with us if they want to. We want to do our part to contribute to a thriving and bustling downtown. We want to mind our own business. And we would want every last bit of it, soup to nuts, to be entirely voluntary. So our tagline, all of Christ for all of life, does not mean that we want to stand on your front porch 24/7, tracts in hand, wondering why you won't open the door anymore. By the way, I just mentioned our people building businesses. This is not something that is controlled in any way by the church. Our members are an enterprising bunch with a shared worldview, but on a practical level, they function in the same way that members of other churches do. They have a living to make, and they do so without direction or control from the church. Put another way, I don't own a chunk of downtown. The only thing I own downtown would be my truck when I am there and the books in my office. But here's the distinction. To the extent that laws and coercion enter into it, we are entirely opposed to any attempts to bring such things about by means of mandates from above. That's not how any of this would ever come about. It will not happen in a top-down fashion. So what about the Christian town part? If such a thing were to happen, it would happen quietly, with no one really noticing as it took shape. And then one day, people would just wake up and realize that the seal of the city had a church spire at the center of it. We find dystopic scenarios of the Handmaid's Tale sort as repulsive as you do, and what we have in mind is something more akin to the 1892 Supreme Court decision in the Holy Trinity case that determined the United States was a Christian nation. We are not looking for a hellhole with Bible verses attached. The second issue would be the confrontations we had with our city government during COVID and the subsequent arrests of some of our people at one of our psalm sings. And I would also add the subsequent prosecution of my son and 2 grandsons because of how they protested those arrests with stickers. My point here is not to go through all of the details of those controversies again, which are still in the courts, but rather simply to frame the whole thing with this larger issue in view. We do not do such things because we are trying to impose an onerous burden on the citizens of Moscow or establish a peculiar view of our own on everyone. We were resisting a coercive mandate, not trying to impose one. And we are doing this for the sake of all of our citizens and not simply ourselves. So we do not believe we should somehow get special privileges or that the laws don't apply to us. Rather, we believe the laws should apply to everyone, including our city officials. The psalm sing where the arrest happened was perfectly legal, which is why the charges were subsequently dropped. So our desire is that all the citizens of Moscow retain their right to do perfectly legal and constitutional things. We don't believe that your constitutional rights should evaporate simply because some people in authority are going along with an artificial and engineered panic. As the full story of the last few years has unfolded, and particularly with the releasing of the Twitter files, the more vindicated we feel in the stand that we felt we had to take. But I'm not trying to get you to agree with that. None of this means that we expect you all to agree with the particular point we are making or the way that we made it. It is that we want you to know that we are also fighting for your right to make points in public that we don't agree with. The bottom line is this: we were not trying to impose our point of view on people who differ. We were resisting the illegal imposition of one point of view on people who differ. This time it was us, but on another occasion it could well be you. So when it comes to your exercise of your constitutional liberties, you have absolutely nothing to fear from us. In fact, on this issue and others like it, we are being the consistent liberals. And even if you do not agree with the reasoning here, I wanted you to know that this is in fact the reasoning here. The arrests were made at a psalm sing, but it could also have happened just as easily with somebody else singing John Lennon's Imagine. And last, if you're aware of us at all, you've probably been made aware of various sexual or molestation scandals that have occurred in our community over the years, and which our leadership has consistently dealt with in a conscientious way. It is not my point to get into the details of any of those cases, but rather, again, to provide a larger frame of reference on them for you. The church is to be thought of as a hospital for sinners and not a rest home for saints. Whenever a church gathers, and particularly if it gathers in larger numbers, as has happened in our community, you are going to attract all kinds: strugglers, victims, Pharisees, hypocrites, and a mass of regular folks at the center seeking to live consistent Christian lives. As our community is now the size of a small town, I don't have any doubt that in the future we will have more gnarly pastoral situations down the road. We do live in a broken and fallen world. It is one of the reasons why pastoral ministry is necessary. Life can be hard, and people need pastoral protection and guidance. We will tackle all such situations as we have sought to do in the past, which means that we want to be biblically responsible in our pursuit of justice and safety for everyone concerned. In the decades that I've been in ministry, I've seen more than a few such tragic situations, but I have never seen one of them that was helped out or improved through becoming a topic of online controversy. Whenever that happens, the people who know the situation are not free to talk, while the people who don't know are under no such limitation. So to help prevent such a complication from ever seeming appropriate, the thing we want you to know is that we are a church that practices church discipline. As necessary, we report crimes to the appropriate authorities. We hold our members to their vows to live as becomes a follower of Christ, and that this is all tied in with our public stand against the degradation of our public morals. We do believe that the pornification of our culture has had destructive ramifications on a large scale, and we want you to understand that we are very much engaged in the fight against every form of sexual abuse. In no way do we defend the indefensible or excuse the inexcusable. I said earlier that I was going to conclude with a heads up, and so here it is now. In the coming year, we are going to be trying various things that we hope will make our situation with the community less adversarial. We are not so foolish as to think that some trivial PR work or a misbegotten charm offensive is going to fix everything, but we are going to be looking for ways to ameliorate what we can as we can. If there's general agreement that things should be ramped down, at least a little, we would like to help ramp it down in any way consistent with conscience. So if you see something like that from us and say, to yourself, please know that it is not a quote-unquote trick. Whatever things we decide to do, it is being offered without guile. Cordially in Christ, Douglas Wilson. So the American system of government, as it was originally received from England, and as it was remodeled by the founders to fit with our circumstances, and as it has subsequently evolved over the last 2 centuries, is still worth preserving. It is running on 2 cylinders now, but it is still running. Introduction. For those who know the backstory, it is kind of odd that you can go to our nation's capital and there visit both the Washington Monument and the Jefferson Memorial. After all, the 2 men were political adversaries on opposite sides of the aisle, and this was before that center aisle was even built. But in another sense, this is just the way it ought to be, in that it helps us see how nations actually form in real life, which is to say they do not form on the drafting tables of the big thinkers, especially including John Locke. Locke gets to chime in, of course, but that is just a piece or two in a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle. Unwritten constitutions. All nations have unwritten constitutions, including those like ours that have written ones as well. For an example of an unwritten requirement, there's nothing in our Constitution that requires us to have a 2-party system, but a 2-party system developed organically here anyway, from the very beginning. The structural logic of our Constitution does encourage a 2-party system, but does not mandate it. So, in a parliamentary system, all the horse trading is done after the election, and a government is formed, sometimes in surprising alliances. In our system, all the same horses get traded, but it is done before the election within the primary politics of the two respective parties. In the early years, before the Constitution was ratified, the two factions were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. After ratification, these respective sympathies took shape in the two political parties, the Federalists and the Republicans. Washington was a Federalist, and John Adams was a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, our third president, was a Republican. But don't be misled by the names. These Republicans were not the same as the party that formed at the time of Lincoln, although they are helpfully called by the same name. These latter Republicans came into being after the Whigs blew up. Still with me? In other words, political parties can come and go, but there are always, on average, two, give or take a bull moose. Back to the founding. The Federalists wanted a strong national government, and the Anti-Federalists were jealous for the preservation of state sovereignty. In this regard, the formation of the Constitution itself was a Federalist victory, in that they wanted a constitution that closely imitated the English Constitution, which they got. At the same time, the Anti-Federalists did us all a big favor by making it necessary to add a Bill of Rights in order to secure ratification. The Constitution, as we received it at the founding, was therefore a compromise document, a Federalist document with Anti-Federalist suspicions folded into it. And yet, nevertheless, after ratification, the Republicans continued to be wary of centralization and jealous of states' rights, and that division continued down to the war between the states, when that particular debate went to the next level. One of the more helpful historical exercises I like to work through is that of trying to identify where I would have landed in past controversies. This is of limited use when thinking about the Athenians and Persians, or the Romans and the Carthaginians, but it can still be surprisingly helpful. Chesterton does this with great effect in The Everlasting Man, and so we can still understand that Carthago delenda est. But when it comes down closer to our time, this exercise applied to our earlier history can really help you sort out what is actually going on now. The Constitutional Convention itself was irregular, meaning that there was no provision for any such thing under the Articles of Confederation. They just did it. At the same time, it was done decently through duly appointed representatives, and the results of their proposal did not take effect until 9 of the 13 states ratified it, in a straight-line vote. It was not a coup. At the same time, Anti-Federalist Patrick Henry was not imagining things when he famously smelled a rat. There were certainly machinations. But these things are complicated. When Shays' Rebellion erupted in 1786, it had to be suppressed with private financing because Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, did not have the wherewithal to take care of it. But also, at the same time, anybody who reads through the details of that rebellion needs to grant that the irate farmers were not imagining things. They were being mercilessly worked by the system. So if you have a simplistic white hats, black hats approach to history, you are going to have trouble. Jefferson was wrong in his sympathies for the French Revolution and his appeal to government by reason, but he was right about that government being best that governs least. Adams was right about the British Constitution, but the Alien and Sedition Act was a piece of work. Jackson represented the rising tide of populist individualism, which did a lot of damage, but he was right about not wanting a central bank, and so on. And Jefferson was an anti-nationalist, but his decision to go through with the Louisiana Purchase was a nationalist masterstroke. Alexander Hamilton was no doubt pleased as punch. People are not ideology units. People are people. Because man is sinful, every system can be abused. And these people who are people are also sinners, which complicates things even further. The Federalists wanted a constitution like the English Constitution, with George Washington reckoned in that number. But Washington had been the leader in our fight against British tyranny, which had been imposed on the colonies in spite of the protections promised by the English Constitution. In other words, the Americans were fighting to regain their rights as Englishmen, and the Englishmen who were fighting them were engaged in the task of trying to take them away. In other words, Washington thought that the system was good and worth fighting for, even though the official guardians of that system had betrayed it. Kind of like now. There are many details involved in this, but here's the zoom-out view. When the colonies were formed, they were given their own charters by the king. These charters included the right to have their own legislatures, which were the bodies that had the authority to impose taxes, because part of the English Constitution was, quote, no taxation without representation, close quote. That was not an American innovation. It was a right that Englishmen had, and which the English Parliament was trying hard to ignore. Parliament had no authority to tax the colonies any more than the legislature of Oregon has the authority to tax the citizens of Arizona. But because of political turmoil in England over the course of the prior century, brought about by the grandiose claims of the Stuarts, this resulted in Parliament chopping off one king's head, Charles I, and running another king off, James II. This naturally made Parliament feel like they were pretty hot stuff, and so they started levying taxes on the colonies just to show everybody who was the boss now. This was unconstitutional, but there was no Clarence Thomas around yet to slap it down. He was not even out of law school. Thus the impasse and the resort to arms. So the Federalists knew that the problem was in men and not in the systems that such men were occupied in distorting and trampling. Although the British system had been used against them, and they had fought and bled to resist those abuses, they still thought the system was better and offered more protections than any other on the market. In contrast, the French revolutionaries wanted to scrap the ancient regime and invite the men with big brains to figure out a system for us, using nothing but the light of pure reason and the spirit of democratic uplift. Whenever people start thinking like that, it is time to start looking around for the tumbrils and guillotines. They are not far off. Because men are sinners, and because that sinfulness goes down close to the bone, they will sin with whatever material they might have. If you centralize the government, they sin with that. If you decentralize it, they sin with that. If you have a strong executive, they sin with that. If you have a weak executive, they sin with that. So the American system of government, as it was originally received from England, and as it was remodeled by the founders to fit with our circumstances, and as it has subsequently evolved over the last 2 centuries, is still worth preserving. It is running on 2 cylinders now, but it is still running. The latest examples of the checks and balances still working would be the spate of SCOTUS decisions handed down just this last week. But constitutional liberty cannot be preserved long-term without someone declaring war on the administrative state. As Philip Hamburger has shown in his book, Is Administrative Law Unlawful? The answer to the question posed is yes, it is unlawful. The kind of regulative state that we currently function under, think EPA, ATF, IRS, etc., the other kind of alphabet enemy, is precisely the kind of state that our Constitution was designed to prevent. At the time of the American War for Independence, despite all the grotesque encroachments, there was still some fight left in those who wanted to restore the older order, which they successfully did. The fact that it needs to be done yet again should surprise absolutely no one. In a future installment, I hope to outline a plan for taking on the administrative state. I have heard that some of your people have been asking why. Why would these parasitic Jews conspire against the Commonwealth like this? I think that if you look around for more than a few minutes, the answer will become quite obvious. What is always the driving motivation for these people? I really don't have to tell you. It is money. That is always what their eyes rest on first. Did you notice how the king just gave the estates of Haman to Hadassah? Just gave them, all of them, and the revenues from them. Dear comrades and brothers in arms, I am writing to you 3 weeks after the funeral of Haman and 2 weeks after the horrific putsch orchestrated by that pestilent fellow Mordecai. Insolent Jew, pretends to be loyal to the God of his fathers, but then swanks around in that adopted name of Mordecai. Dedicated to Marduk, is he? Dedicated to the elders of Zion, more like. Some might object to my use of putsch because the king remains, but all our authority that was vested in his counselors behind the scenes has borne the brunt of this coup. A coup it most certainly was. I haven't been able to write because the uproar in Susa has been so difficult to navigate. We've been fully occupied with moving from place to place, mostly at night. And then, when I finally had this letter largely composed, we had to wait on a courier. Many of our best men had been lost in the massacre. We even had to hold the funeral of Haman in an undisclosed place, and that was before they made their move, before the actual slaughtering started. And now they are in control of everything. The seal, the ring, the king's heart, everything. That witch queen is beautiful, I'll give her that, but what a calculating, cold-hearted jade she has been. But you should hear the rabble talk about her, like she was the best thing that ever happened. Of course, the rabble always think that life is a beauty pageant. She has the king dazzled, all right. She must know some tricks and turns that Vashti didn't. I even saw him extend the scepter to her once when she dared to come into the throne room uninvited. The effrontery of these Hebrews. It doesn't matter what we do or what measures we take, they always manage to get through somehow, and if you blink just once or twice, they turn up in key positions. I even found myself wondering about the new cupbearer, Nehemiah. You can't trust anyone anymore. At least we know her real name now, Hadassah, which is more than can be said of her cousin, Mordecai. At least that's the story, because he sure doesn't look like her cousin. More like a grandfather, I'd say. Haman was the first one to notice any of these Jew plots. What a man he was. I well remember the day when he first spoke to me about it. "I'm not paranoid, Zethar," he said, "but I'm starting to notice things. This is going to be a long war, I can tell now, but at least he will always have the honor of having been the first one up to the top of the siege ladders. He was the first one to notice, really to notice. Not many of our people even know this, but he was a direct lineal descendant of Agag, the great king of the Amalekites. This explains his regal bearing and the true sense of authority that Haman always carried with him. You could always tell. He understood himself to be entitled to the great honors he received. Some, even in our own camp, sometimes complained or tried to represent it as envious greed or personal aggrandizement, but nothing could be more wide of the mark. Haman was simply secure in the knowledge of who he was, and his wife was even more secure in that same knowledge. And Haman saw it all from the beginning. He already knew that Mordecai was descended from Kish, that two-bit lackey family that used to dance along behind Samuel, that shameless butcher. You've no doubt heard the story of how that Samuel hacked Agag to pieces, and what a dishonorable business that was. Haman knew all about that backstory, and so when he saw Mordecai refuse to bow down that time, when everyone else knew what their duty was, he understood immediately that the time had arrived, and that the cabal of Jewish elders behind Mordecai must have given the signal that it was their moment to move. And that is why Haman had to act. The slander the Jews are circulating is that the decree Haman arranged with the king was a murderous one, and some of our people have been swayed by it. But what these chattering morons do not understand is the nature of a preemptive strike. A coup was certainly in the offing, and it was most necessary to act when we did. Would to the gods we had been able to act just a few weeks earlier. Haman certainly wanted to, if you remember. He knew there was no time to waste. If only our other counselors had understood his sense of urgency and the reasons for it. We've had quite a debate amongst ourselves over the matter of Bigthan and Teresh. We have simpletons in our own ranks, sad to say, and they have simply accepted the enemy's propaganda on the point. But as far as I've been able to determine, these two men were loyal subjects of the king, and everyone knew it, except for Mordecai. He had to have made up the evidence against them as a way of ingratiating himself with the king. The story is that after he accused them, the thing was investigated and confirmed, but you know how these Jews are. Rigging evidence in a situation like that would be child's play for them. I was jubilant when that particular plot seemed like it was going to come to nothing, but that was when the king's sleepless night came. That had to have been just sheer bad luck. And Hadassah, I refuse to call her Esther, has been a conniving little hellcat. I understand from some of our sources, who still remain among the courtiers, that she was under strict orders from Mordecai not to reveal her people or kindred to anybody. Why would you hide something like that unless you were up to no good? And why would Mordecai insist on it unless their conspiracy was already in motion? The thing is as plain as the fields of Shinar. I have heard that some of your people have been asking why. Why would these parasitic Jews conspire against the Commonwealth like this? I think that if you look around for more than a few minutes, the answer will become quite obvious. What is always the driving motivation for these people? I really don't have to tell you. It is money. That is always what their eyes rest on first. Did you notice how the king just gave the estates of Haman to Hadassah? Just gave them. All of them, and the revenues from them. That Mordecai is no doubt plenty pleased with himself, but however pleased he is, I have no doubt that he is nowhere close to being satisfied. There is more to be squeezed out of the Persian people, after all. And then when the king gave them the right to resist the righteous sanctions and restrictions that had been established with regard to them and their tricks, not only were they given the right to resist, but also the right to pillage and return, to take spoil. They were actually given the right to ransack the law-abiding citizens of Persia, their own neighbors, who just happened to be among the wealthiest citizens. Naturally, it is not hard to conclude that money is the driving force behind all of this. You do know who controls the three largest banks in Susa, don't you? I tell you, it is hard to describe the magnitude of the disaster, but it is also equally plain that these Jews have been coveting the wealth of Persia ever since they got here. After this episode, anybody who doesn't understand the rapacity of these Jews is someone not to be trusted with any civic responsibility at all. While Haman was the first one to notice, there will be plenty of people who will be vying to be the last to notice. In the meantime, what should we be doing? On the one hand, we have to give our attention to whatever it takes to regroup our forces. That will take some time, and we will need to find a satrap or governor who's willing to pretend that we're not there in his jurisdiction. I know several likely candidates, and will soon send you their names by a means that is less risky. Until that time, what account shall we give of this calamity? I have mentioned the issue of noticing a few times, and this is how we must frame it. We must deny that we presented any threat whatever to the Commonwealth. Of course not. We were merely guilty of the crime of noticing what these Jews were up to. We must not allow the Hebrews any opportunity to villainize Haman, and we must never be embarrassed by his far-sighted leadership. He was simply the first to notice and has become the first martyr of noticing, and we must be courageous enough to carry on his legacy of noticing. It is the least we can do. They were far more prepared to resist us than any peace-loving segment of the population had any right to be. Or did you not notice? Under the care of the gods, Zethar. Many Christians are deeply uncomfortable with this particular literary tradition. It seems to them like everybody in it is having too much fun. And when, as occasionally happens, one of the rambunctious fellows takes aim at the wowzers and actually hits his target, it then becomes easy for them to attribute the potency of that shot to everything else that is being done in that spirit. Somewhere in C.S. Lewis, he was writing about how colorful the Elizabethans were, and he said that this was a gift that the English had apparently bequeathed to their American cousins. I think there's something to this, and perhaps it will help us to understand shoot cussing, slang, and other related what's the plural of flamboyance? There's a long American tradition of this, probably beginning with Benjamin Franklin, often called the first American. I'm speaking of a cultural and literary tradition here, and not about morals or regeneration, which would be quite distinct matters. From Franklin to Twain to Mencken, you can plainly detect a certain breezy approach to serious matters, and which does not cease holding to the seriousness of it. Franklin, in his Poor Richard's Almanac, likely invented the one-liner. Over time, this developed into our hero, wisecracking his way through various adventures, or, better yet, our hero being accompanied by a sidekick who would provide the wisecracks. Franklin also probably coined the phrase smart aleck, and a certain attitude was born. This is not to say that all Americans are like this, of course not, but it is to say that enough of them are like this, or are appreciative of this style and form, to be able to sustain it as a long American literary tradition. I'm not here talking about jesters or humorists, because every culture has had their jokes and jokers. I'm talking about a particular kind of humor. I once had an interaction with a woman who objected to a certain element in my preaching, which was the fact that I felt free to use what she considered to be quote-unquote slang. This was a more formidable objection in another era, when there was a more formal recognition of what more formal discourse was supposed to sound like. People knew what it was, in other words, and they therefore knew, roughly, where the boundary between proper English and slang was. And surely, the thinking went, if you don't hear proper English in the pulpit, then what is the world coming to? The center does not hold, the best lack all conviction, cats living with dogs, etc. Slang was not thought to be crass or obscene, but it was believed to be quote-unquote low. My father belonged to a generation where this was more meaningful, and he never used any shoot words that I can recall, and he also worked to keep slang out of his vocabulary. It was instinctive with him, bone deep. At the same time, this desire on the part of more educated Americans to avoid the world of casual slang was the very thing that made the exuberance of the world of slang even possible. It gave the inventive longshoreman or sailor on a tramp steamer something to push against. But depending on how gaudy it is, I work to include slang in how I write, and I work at being colorful in other ways as well. In addition to all this, I use italics in my published prose a lot, that being a prosodic device, like talking with your hands. If you want to accent something, well, then accent it, man. All of this is one of the reasons why more than a few readers constantly assume that I'm always making fun of them. This is because they belong to a different tradition, that, say, of stuffing all the shirts, and they have trouble distinguishing a man who's making fun from a man who's just having fun. I will return to this point at the end. We all know the main characters when it comes to shoot cussing. This is a practice of substituting words for other words, altering and cleaning them up slightly. In other words, we say heck for hell and darn for damn and shoot for, shoot. By gosh is in the form of an oath and is subbed in for by God. I would suggest that we should think of all these as the lazy man's slang, to be generally avoided not because it is actual cursing, but because it is the leftover residue of a previous generation's fastidiousness. Please allow an illustration from my time in the Navy. I was a quartermaster, which meant that I was responsible for navigation. When we were conducting training operations, we did so in operating areas that were marked out on our charts. Obviously, the squares on the ocean surface were somewhat arbitrary, but we had orders to go out and conduct our exercises within a particular operating area. It was standard practice for us to give ourselves a 2-mile buffer inside the operating area to prevent going outside it accidentally. One time we had a bad navigational fix, and so the navigator told me to add another 2-mile limit inside the first one. And then an inexperienced officer took over the con in the middle of the night, and he saw what the navigator had done, and so then, in his nervousness, he had me add a third 2-mile limit. Our operating area was shrinking significantly. This process, continued indefinitely, would have resulted in us sailing around and around in a tight little circle. Hard left rudder and hold it there. We tend to put 2-mile limits on our language. If someone gets angry with someone for no good reason and says, "Go to hell," that is a curse and violates the standards for Christian speech. Romans 3:14. If someone tells a friend a lame joke and his friend responds with a jocular "Go to hell," this tends to undermine the seriousness of damnation, which is no joking matter. Okay, so avoid that also. 2-mile limit. Heck no instead of hell no really is milder, but also somewhat lazy. It is more like filler and not really that colorful. The heck you say is better, but it is hard to explain why, probably because of the syntax. But suppose that one day it is really hot outside, and someone comes in and says that it is hot as hell out there. Again, lazy. But suppose he says it is hotter than the hinges on the gates of hell. Is that really trivializing damnation? Or is it just colorful? Or to use an expression I've referred to elsewhere, that was blacker than the Earl of Hell's riding boots. Okay, that's good. Then there would be expressions where the original meaning is lost to pretty much everybody. Say that a visitor says that your toddler is a cute little Dickens. This word Dickens is a substitute for devil, and perhaps your visitor is trying to tell you something. But it is more likely that he just means cute little guy, without reference to the Prince of Darkness at all. And son of a gun seems innocent enough, but it refers back to the prostitutes who used to service the British Navy. When a woman was pregnant, and because, of course, no one knew who the father was, the child was the son of a gun. But the chances are good that when an oldest boy comes in from the backyard with a tale of some exploit, and his dad exclaims, "Why, you son of a gun?" the intended meaning was probably not "you son of a whore." Meanings change as meanings are forgotten. If somebody were trying to write a short story set in medieval times, and their understanding of medieval sayings and archaic expressions had been acquired from old Batman comic books, they might find themselves using words like zounds or oddbodkins. But these were originally oaths that had some real bite in them. Zounds was a contraction of God's wounds, and oddbodkins is swearing by the host in the Roman Catholic Mass, God's little bodies, or God's bodikins, or oddbodkins. I said that I would return to a point made earlier. Many Christians are deeply uncomfortable with this particular literary tradition. It seems to them like everybody in it is having too much fun. And when, as occasionally happens, one of the rambunctious fellows takes aim at the wowsers and actually hits his target, it then becomes easy for them to attribute the potency of that shot to everything else that is being done in that spirit. They look at everybody having fun and assume that they are doing nothing but making fun. This is how it's possible for me to make a joke at my own expense and to have it be interpreted as an attack on somebody else. This is the iron chain logic of 2-mile limits. The kind of man who would claim that his argument for eliminating the Federal Reserve was the butterfly's boots is exactly the kind of man who would make fun of my sainted mother. The political battle over FV was won by the anti-FV forces. They obtained a bunch of denominational statements which they can point to and say, "See, heresy, the thing is settled." For the men who were involved in that political effort, it would take an enormous amount of humility to walk anything back. I don't see any indications that this is going to happen. Introduction. I'm happy to announce an impending rapprochement on federal vision issues, albeit a rapprochement that is still surrounded with a few remaining confusions. I trust that I will be able to remove those confusions below. Wish me luck, everybody. In a class for RTS Charlotte, Kevin DeYoung spent some time on federal vision issues in the clip embedded below. He says, quote, "If you're in the PCA and you're seeking ordination, I would recommend, if on the floor of the presbytery someone asks, 'What do you think about federal vision?' say, 'I do not agree with federal vision,' and then explain. That's what the presbyters are generally looking for." KDY. But the reason I think we are closing in on a rapprochement is that Kevin outlines the core beliefs of FV theology, and I agreed with him on almost all of them, and have done so explicitly and repeatedly over the course of many years. He may not have intended it, but he sure enough gave me a clean bill of health, for which I am most grateful. The one place where there remains genuine disagreement is with child communion, but Kevin said here that there are good people who differ with him on that, so that need not be a disruption. So the reason I think there are remaining confusions is that Kevin apparently does not know about my agreement with almost all of them. He associates my name very closely with the FV, but then for some reason does not attribute my teaching to the FV. He's using the broad descriptor FV as a shibboleth, applying it wholesale to anyone associated with FV, most predominantly me. But our impending reconciliation should be based on this. I pronounce it sibboleth, the very same way Kevin does. I do have friends who don't say it that way, true enough, but then again, so does Kevin, e.g. Lig Duncan, John Piper. A quick list of areas of agreement. You can check it out yourself below. From 53 minutes to 1:18, Kevin outlines the core beliefs of FV, which will give me an opportunity to touch on the big-ticket items. Kevin says, FV resists the traditional distinctions between internal and external, or objective and subjective distinctions of the covenant. Covenant as legal administration versus covenant as communion of life. Doug Wilson says it's all covenant objectivity. My response would be to deny that it is all objectivity. I wrote an entire book dedicated to defending the absolute necessity of the new birth against the church, referring to an internal transformation of the heart. Quote, and this is why I keep going on about the absolute need for regeneration and the cross of Jesus Christ. It is only a work of the Spirit that can give us new hearts. Christian civilization is absolutely necessary, but without those new hearts, Christian standards of civilization are intolerable, as can be easily verified. Mere Christendom, pages 226-227. Kevin argues that for FV advocates, the covenant is entirely objective, while the historic reform position teaches that there's an objective component and a subjective component. Again, I agree that the covenant is an objective reality and that faithfulness to the covenant is subjectively owned. In the CREC exam, I was asked, quote, are there subjective elements of the covenant? If so, what are some? My reply was, yes, certainly. The most important would be faith. So agreement number one, Kevin says that the covenant has an objective aspect and a subjective aspect. I agree. Kevin says that FV rejects the covenant of works, but I affirm the covenant of works, although I prefer to call it the covenant of life or the covenant of creation. But I'm not monocovenantal. The covenant with our first parents in the garden was a distinct covenant from the covenant of grace, and it was a covenant conditioned on strict and perpetual obedience, a condition which Adam broke. So agreement number two. Kevin says that there are two covenants, one prior to the fall, conditioned on strict obedience, and one after the fall, a covenant of unmerited grace. I agree. Kevin says that FV rejects the imputation of the active obedience of Christ, but I affirm the imputation of the active obedience of Christ and insist, together with Machen, that there's no hope without it. This is how I put it 12 years ago. Quote, classic Reformed theology calls it the active obedience of Christ. What it means simply is Christ for us. In your salvation, you were not given a fraction of Christ, but rather were given all that he ever did. In the life of Jesus, Israel finally does it right, and he does it right on behalf of all Israel, all who are gathered to him by faith. God rest ye merry, page 50. 2012. So agreement number three, Kevin affirms the imputation of the active obedience of Christ. So do I. Kevin says that in FV theology, works are a condition of final justification and not corroborating evidence that the person has been justified. This is yet another point of agreement between Kevin and me. As I put it way back in 2007, quote, I hold that if any of my good works attempted to contribute to my justification before God, then they should be slathered with bacon grease and thrown into hell. The Auburn Avenue Chronicles, page 398. So agreement number four, Kevin says that good works are corroborating evidence of justification. I agree. Kevin says that FV equates covenant and election, thus making someone's elect status as unsure as their covenant status would be. If someone can be excommunicated, for example, that would mean their election is also up for grabs. This is yet another place where I agree with Kevin. Election and covenant membership are not the same thing at all. Quote, to pummel the point, if I may, I have taught in very clear and diverse ways that the grace given to the decretally elect at the point of the effectual call is grace that is qualitatively different than the common operations of the Spirit enjoyed for a season by the unregenerate covenant member. I have heaped this point up in a rumpled pile and have danced around it, gesticulating with enthusiasm. I've made a big building out of this point and put a blinking neon sign on top of it. If this point were an overpass, I've spray painted my agreement with it in bright green letters at least 18 inches high. With my white chef's hat on, I've wheeled this point out of the kitchen on a cart, poured brandy all over it, and set it on fire. If the point were a pudding, I would have added 3 eggs beyond what the recipe called for. To summarize briefly, this is not something I have somehow neglected to say. The Auburn Avenue Chronicles, page 155. So agreement number 5. Kevin says that covenant membership and election are not the same thing at all. I agree. Kevin says that FV muddles the visible-invisible church distinction, but I affirm that distinction. I also use the historical eschatological distinction to point to the same two groups of people. Quote, the entire company of the elect, the whole number of them, invisible now to everyone but God alone, will be made manifest to everyone at the eschaton, and that church will be without spot or wrinkle or any other blemish. And that eschatological church I define as the whole number of the elect. The Auburn Avenue Chronicles, page 225. In the CREC examination of my views, I said this, quote, the church militant is the church on earth. The church triumphant is in heaven. The historic church is the church on earth in history. The eschatological church is that same church at the culmination of history at the eschaton. My terminology for this is historical eschatological, but it answers to Augustine's division of pilgrim eschatological. And if by invisible visible you mean the church on earth and the company of the elect, I can certainly live with that. So agreement number 6. Kevin affirms the visible-invisible church distinction. So do I. Kevin says that for FV advocates, sacraments have a saving and regenerating efficacy of their own rather than being a confirming grace. In the CREC exam, I was asked how the sacraments communicate grace, and I said, quote, they communicate grace through the instrumentality of faith. Worthy receivers have that faith because it was given to them by God, lest any should boast. Unworthy receivers do not have faith, and hence they are under the weight of a greater condemnation. So agreement number 7. Kevin says that the sacraments have no saving power of their own. I thoroughly agree. Kevin says that because of how FV identifies election with covenant membership, this necessarily unsettles the saints when it comes to assurance of salvation. I agree that identifying election with covenant membership would have exactly this tendency, but as stated above, I do not identify the two and follow the classic Reformed understanding of assurance of salvation. In Reformed is Not Enough, I devote an entire chapter to the theme of assurance. Quote, God does not want his children to lack an assurance of their standing before him. He wants us to know what he has given to us. This is a command that can actually be obeyed. Reformed is Not Enough, page 125. So agreement number 8. Kevin says that believers can be assured of their eternal salvation. I agree. So as I consider Kevin's summary of the tenets of the FV, the only place where we have a straightforward, flat-out disagreement is with child communion. So according to this metric that he has set out concerning FV, if I agree with him, then I must not be FV. If he agrees with me, then he is FV. The disagreement over child communion might necessitate laboring in different denominations, but an evangelical ecumenism can certainly shake hands across the denominational divide, Reformed Baptists and Presbyterians say, or Lutherans and Presbyterians. Why not this? Why not here? The central difference that I would have with Kevin, therefore, would not be a doctrinal one. It would be with regard to his reasoning that associates my name with FV, while at the same time disassociating my teaching from the FV. So which is it? If I'm still FV despite all of this, then it should be necessary to allow that there are numerous FV adherents who are fully Orthodox and robustly Westminsterian. But if I'm not FV, then why is he associating my name with it at all? Friends, associations, and third-year seminarians. I would be more than willing to shake hands with Kevin and call it good. And as should be apparent from the foregoing, there are no doctrinal reasons that would prevent this. It is quite true that I have not denounced a number of my friends, the FV oatmeal stouts, and I continue to not denounce them. I think they are more Augustinian than Calvinist and would love to persuade them, but that is another issue. But my failure to denounce my friends is paralleled by Kevin not denouncing John Piper. You may recall that Piper has insisted on an affectional dimension to saving faith, which has been sharply criticized by Fesco and Waters. And incidentally, while we are here, the Westminster describes saving faith as quote-unquote lively, Westminster Confession of Faith 16:2. One of the things that a living eye does is see, and life is not a reward for the work of seeing. And Kevin has not denounced Lig Duncan for that did not age well forward to Woke Church, a book that gave away the reformational store. So while friendships can be challenging, they are not the same thing as confessional statements. Last comment. The political battle over FV was won by the anti-FV forces. They obtained a bunch of denominational statements which they can point to and say, see, heresy, the thing is settled. For the men who were involved in that political effort, it would take an enormous amount of humility to walk anything back. I don't see any indications that this is going to happen. But we are in a different world now. There are many young pastors out there and third-year seminarians for whom an honest review of the controversy will cost them little or nothing. They can afford to review all the evidence. In this respect, it is like the Marrow controversy in Scotland. The Reformed Church of the day condemned them stoutly, but Reformed history vindicated them.
That's the life I want. I want to be 70 and have 18 virgin. Let's go!
I'm Tucker Carlson, and I am here with the very famous and highly controversial Pastor Doug Wilson.
Even more controversial. Do you doubt what I say? We live in a time that does not believe in any kind of transcendent truth at all. We are on our own, dust in the wind, motes in the sunbeam, plastic cups on a river in flood, and at the same time, and not unrelated, the enforcement mechanisms regarding various aspects of the dominant narrative have been ruthless and savage. Introduction. Brian Stelter, formerly of CNN, recently hosted a panel discussion at Davos for the World Economic Forum, and the topic was disinformation. Other folks might call it misinformation, tomato, tomato. But regardless, in Stelter's appearance there, we should find a cautionary tale. Davos, for those who don't know, is a place in Switzerland where the world's elites periodically gather in order to save us all from these darn carbon emissions. They, of course, all burn a small ocean of fossil fuel to get there, and all of their private jets, and I even hear that the swank factor of their wealth is such that many of them even order egg omelets for their breakfast. Ostentatious, I call it. Back to Stelter. To have a gentleman like that on a panel discussion on disinformation exhibits what might be called a lack of self-awareness. If they ever were to develop some scientific way to measure such things, the needle would be bouncing on the right side of the little handheld cluelessness meter. But perhaps it is not cluelessness. Perhaps the people who are dominating the world's agenda did not get where they are by being stupid. What else might be happening? The meaning of misinformation. When average folks hear a word like misinformation, they assume that a claim is being made about the way things are out in the world. They hold to a common sense correspondence theory of truth, meaning that if someone says that it is raining outside and you go look out the window and see nothing but bright sunshine, you have a right to say that this person was quote unquote wrong. If it is a larger issue, one with political ramifications, you might say that he was purveying quote unquote misinformation. The idea is that in order to be true, statements have to conform to the state of affairs that they are pointing to out there in the world. In other words, the verbal statement needs to conform to the facts in order to avoid being misinformation. Now, this is a good statement of what ought to be used to evaluate truth and falsehood, but it betrays a thundering naivete about what is actually being done to us. For some decades now, tucked away in the floor joists underneath obscure departments in prestigious universities, certain termites, postmodernism, relativism, subjectivism, and other forms of goo thought, have been industriously eating away at all such notions of objectivity. But the mistake of some critics who have seen this happening has been to think that the ultimate goal of said termites is simply the destruction of truth as such, after which the building falls down. But something else is actually happening. The left actually wants to replace the floor joists with something else, their own supporting structure. It may appear that they want the anarchy of a free fall, but that is mistaken. They want to replace the supporting joists of facts with the supporting joists of narrative. And so one thing has remained constant. Misinformation continues to be a failure to conform. But in the olden days, it was a failure to conform to the way things actually were, and now it is a failure to conform to the narrative. The fact that the narrative can change overnight is neither here nor there. As Orwell put it, quote, "The past was alterable. The past never had been altered. Oceania was at war with East Asia. Oceania had always been at war with East Asia." This replacement of the facts with narrative is an essential feature of totalitarianism. The fact that it is currently being crammed down our throats is the central indication that we are being prepared for the totalitarian moment. Such a totalitarian moment can be identified when these two things are present. The first is a sophistical disregard for the objectivity of truth, particularly revealed truth from God. And the second is that we see a fundamentalist zeal when it comes to enforcement of the current narrative. When those two things are present together, you can rest assured that you are in the middle of a humanist power play. The fact that it is so erratic does not keep it from being mandatory. Do you doubt what I say? We live in a time that does not believe in any kind of transcendent truth at all. We are on our own, dust in the wind, motes in the sunbeam, plastic cups on a river in flood, and at the same time, and not unrelated, the enforcement mechanisms regarding various aspects of the dominant narrative have been ruthless and savage. Tell me, are you surrounded by a live and let live attitude when it comes to vaccines, masks, lockdowns, Pride Month, wokeness, Critical theory? Indigenous peoples? Patriarchy? Whiteness? To ask the question is to answer it. The current narrative, whatever it is, will be enforced with a club, the kind of club that has spikes coming out of it. There is no such thing as truth, but the narrative will be enforced as though Thomas de Torquemada had been made director of the Ministry of Truth, thumbscrews and all. And so whenever you are dealing with some ministry of truth or other, always remember that you are actually dealing with the ministry of the narrative. Useful idiots. The phrase useful idiot has been attributed to Lenin, but that has not yet been confirmed. Nevertheless, whether or not he said it, he should have. That kind of person played into his success, and they were all around him. The common usage of the phrase today applies in many situations and refers to a patsy who is cunningly used by some ruthless power broker higher up. Brian Stelter does not appear to be the sharpest knife in the drawer, and yet there he is leading a panel discussion at Davos with elite heads all over the room nodding in agreement. This is an ancient tactic. When certain syncretistic agents of compromise were establishing their mash-up religion back in old Israel, what did they do back then? Quote, so they feared the Lord and made unto themselves of the lowest of them priests of the high places, which sacrificed for them in the houses of the high places. 2 Kings 17:32. Low priests for the high places. That's the ticket. Now, unfortunately, the Christian world has supplied these behind-the-scenes leftists with an almost endless supply of these useful idiots. We've been a veritable seminary for such low priests. Nurtured as they have been on a deracinated Christian faith that applies a truncated gospel to the minimal task of getting their white little hinder parts into heaven, they then have to fill out the content of the rest of their thinking from other sources. So for the remainder of their worldview, they depend upon what they can pick up from NPR, uplifting quotes on their Starbucks cups, and casual conversations with the cashiers at Trader Joe's. The end result is a soggy, sad bag of bromides that is subbed in for thinking like an educated Christian. Even if they don't call it woke, they are being wokenized, which is kind of like being tenderized by one of those meat mallets. When the treatment is over, you are constantly aware of how any true statement you might make could be misunderstood by somebody else and how it could possibly hurt their feelings. And at the mention of somebody's feelings, a bailiff comes in out of that little door on the side and cries, all rise. So even when such Christians are not woke themselves, they are not at all aware of the crucial differences between the facts and the narrative, or the radical changes in the editorial staff of our official dictionaries that have taken place in the last few years, or just how off-putting being winsome is. Classical Christian education was born for this time. As many of you know, I've been deeply invested in the cause of restoring classical Christian education in our time. We've been successful in many ways, but we are also going to be under siege for that very same reason. The kind of education we are providing, rightly provided, is the kind of education that enables our graduates to see through this postmodern cavalcade of claptrap. We were established for this moment and must make sure we do not flake at precisely the wrong time. And we must be careful. There are some in the classical Christian world who already care too much about what the diseased world of academia considers reputable. They are either, quote-unquote, too friendly with or, quote-unquote, not suspicious enough of. They want what we are doing in the classical Christian school movement to be recognized, to be taken seriously in the academic world in the long run. But why in the world would we want something like that? The modern academic world has been the source of many of our modern ills, and the cataract of nonsense that pours out of that world is precisely what we were established to fight. We started an alternative school system precisely because the current one is so toxic, and because a large number of parents were put off by all the green pus around the edges. We really must avoid the please respect us disease that afflicts a certain kind of evangelical. In effect, such brothers want to say to the liberal world, I'll call you a Christian if you call me a scholar. It ends with the Christians aching for the respect of the most disreputable people on the planet. Here's the strategy for such clueless Christians, stated plainly. One of the central blessings that comes with a genuine classical education is that it enables one to take off the provincial blinders that each generation tends to have. The provincial blinders in our day are fashioned out of selective winsomeness, respect for marginalized voices, a climate conscience, a zeal for diversity hires, and a secularized comstockery. C.S. Lewis once said, in response to the relevance mongers of his day, whatever is not eternal is eternally out of date. These are words to live by. The permanent things are never to be determined by a voice vote of a flash mob on a justice jag. Speaking of Lewis, he dedicated the allegory of love to his friend Owen Barfield, and in the preface said this about him. Above all, the friend to whom I have dedicated this book has taught me not to patronize the past, and has trained me to see the present as itself a period. I desire for myself no higher function than to be one of the instruments whereby his theory and practice in such matters may become more widely effective. C.S. Lewis, The Allegory of Love, page 8. The permanent things are inextricably tied to the way things are, the way they have always been, and the way they always will be. They are not in any way tied to the narrative. A concluding parable. Let the reader understand.
Hey, what's up? You still have another set?
I'm taking my son home.
I can't believe you, Dad. You're embarrassing me in front of the pastor.
Mr. Hill, you just don't get it. This is how we testify.
Praise him!
Ugh. Can't you see you're not making Christianity better? You're just making rock and roll work.
So then, some Gentiles are groping in the dark, seeking after God. In order to reconcile this with what Paul teaches us in Romans 3, which is that no one seeks after God, we must postulate that God was at work in their midst by various means, such as unlikely prophets. And this not of themselves, lest any man should boast. So, in the light of all the foregoing, did Epimenides know God? Will we meet him in the resurrection? One of the difficulties that hampers our efforts in apologetics is an unfortunate tendency that we have in projecting New Testament categories back into the Old Testament. What this amounts to is that Christians tend to make a simple equation between Jew and Gentile in the Old Testament as being equivalent to Christian and non-Christian in the New Testament era. But this is simply not the case. In the New Testament era, because the church is now Catholic and universal, it is necessary for everyone who wants to be saved to come to Christ for that salvation. They must call upon him, and when they do, they have a responsibility to then be baptized in order to come into the visible church. The elect among them are part of the invisible church. Neither is there salvation in any other, for there's none other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. Acts 4:12. In short, those who want to be saved today need to become Christians. But was it necessary for those who wanted to be saved in the Old Testament to become Jews? Well, not a bit of it. Old Testament Goyim. We have multiple examples of Gentiles trusting in the God of the Jews, but without becoming Jews themselves. For ease of reference, let me pack just some of them into one paragraph for you. We have Naaman the Syrian, Luke 4:27, and after his conversion, 2 Kings 5:17, he was even given permission to push his master's wheelchair into the house of Rimmon, 2 Kings 5:18. We have the king of Nineveh and all his people, Jonah 3:6 and following. We have Jethro, the priest of Midian, Exodus 3:1. We have Melchizedek, a Canaanite priest and type of Christ, to whom Abraham paid tithes, Genesis 14:18, Hebrews 7:1 and 2. David stored the Ark of the Covenant at the house of a Gentile, Obed-Edom, 2 Samuel 6:10, and he was a Gittite, which meant he probably graduated from the same high school that Goliath did. Later on, this Obed-Edom was made a porter at the tabernacle of David, 1 Chronicles 15:18. And when Solomon built the temple, in his prayer of dedication, he assumed that various Gentiles would pray toward his temple and would be received, 1 Kings 8:41 through 43. And then when Jesus made a whip and cleared out the money changers and the sellers of sacrificial animals, he was clearing out the court of the Gentiles in order to make room for them to worship. And he taught, saying unto them, Is it not written, My house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer? But ye have made it a den of thieves. Mark 11:17. Gentiles are simply not the non-Christians of the Old Testament. Quite a few of them were unbelievers, true enough, but then again, that was the case for the Jews as well. The curious case of Epimenides. Now, this being the case, what would make us think that the only saved Gentiles from the time of the Old Testament would need to be actually referred to by the Old Testament in order to be numbered among the saved? So let us consider the odd case of Epimenides, a wise man from Crete who lived in the 6th century before Christ, right around 600 BC. This would make him a contemporary of Jeremiah and Ezekiel. We can begin with some of the things that Paul says about him in his instructions to Titus, and then look at what Paul says and does when he comes to Athens. Paul quotes him favorably in his letter to Titus, and in that place he calls him a prophet. Not a false prophet, mind you, but a prophet, even a prophet of their own. We don't have any complete texts by Epimenides, but we do have various citations of him in different places. And according to one reconstruction of a portion of a work of his called Cretica, Epimenides was responding to some Cretans who had been maintaining that Zeus had been immortal once, instead of being essentially divine. He was so much immortal in their account that they had built a tomb for him, which Epimenides did not appreciate at all. They fashioned a tomb for thee, O holy and high one, the Cretans, always liars, evil beasts, idle bellies. But thou art not dead, thou livest and abidest forever, for in thee we live and move and have our being. Epimenides, Cretica, reconstructed. You may recognize that last line as well. Paul quotes it in his sermon to the men of Athens, Acts 17:28. And this means it might be a good time to pause that discussion in order to talk about the relationship that Epimenides had with Athens. Centuries before, the city of Athens had been suffering under a grievous plague, which they attributed to divine retribution for an act of treachery that one king Megacles had committed when he slaughtered some men who had surrendered under an amnesty. The Athenians had many gods, as Paul noted centuries later, and they had sought to propitiate them all, but to no effect. The fierce plague continued. The Pythian oracle then told them to send to Crete for Epimenides, which they did. When he arrived, he had them build numerous altars to an unknown god, which they then did. The places where the altars were to be built were identified by sheep lying down at an unusual time in the morning instead of grazing. When they sacrificed to this unknown god, a remarkable thing happened. It stopped the plague. This placed a sharp distinction between this set of sacrifices and what they'd been attempting in their sacrifices to false gods before. In addition, Paul had made a sharp distinction as well. He had been horrified by all the idols, temples, and altars that he saw there in Athens, Acts 17:16. The verb used indicates that he was provoked, vexed, or exasperated by all of it. But there was one altar that he was not vexed by, an altar that Epimenides had had them build. We know that this altar did not provoke him because he preached to them that the God who was ignorantly worshipped at that altar, Acts 17:23, was the God of all creation. Now this true God presides over all the nations of men. And why is this? According to Paul, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him, and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Acts 17:27 and 28. There are two citations here. One likely one is from Epimenides in praise of the immortal Zeus, and in the reconstruction, just 2 lines away from the passage that Paul quoted in his letter to Titus. The next citation is from a poet named Aratus, a Stoic poet from Cilicia, which incidentally was Paul's own province. That quotation comes from another hymn to Zeus entitled Phenomena. So then, some Gentiles are groping in the dark, seeking after God. In order to reconcile this with what Paul teaches us in Romans 3, which is that no one seeks after God, we must postulate that God was at work in their midst by various means, such as unlikely prophets, and this not of themselves, lest any man should boast. Now clearly not every Zeus is Zeus. There is the original immortal Zeus that the Cretans thoughtfully built a tomb for. That's not it. There was also the Zeus of folklore, the Homeric Zeus, famous for his skirt chasing and other inappropriate activities. That's not it either. But then there was the Zeus of the philosophers, the Theos, who had created all things, the Most High God. This vague deity was something that Paul was willing to work with. Epimenides knew the true God, through a glass darkly. He knew that he had to be there, but did not appear to know his name. Lewis among the pagans. In a number of places, C.S. Lewis argues that the untutored pagans did not get absolutely everything wrong. In the light of the foregoing, it seems undeniable to me that his central point is correct and entirely biblical. As the hermit History puts it in his allegory, The Pilgrim's Regress, the landlord, God, would send the pagans glimpses of something beyond themselves by sending them pictures, and the pagans would try to capture it in order to hang on to it, but it would never work out. Their image of the divine would regularly become diseased. They went on making up more and more stories for themselves about the pictures, and then pretending the stories were true. They turned to brown girls and tried to believe that that was what they wanted. There was no absurdity and no indecency they did not commit. But however far they went, the landlord was too many for them. Just when their own stories seemed to have completely overgrown the original messages and hidden them beyond recovery, suddenly the landlord would send them a new message, and all their stories would look stale. The Pilgrim's Regress, page 155. The fact that Lewis was looser with his charity than he should have been, think of Emeth in the last battle, does not mean that the central point is wrong. It just means that Lewis applied the point more liberally than perhaps was wise. The point still stands. How that point from the Old Testament would apply to a pagan people in Central America in the year 200 AD would not be for us to pry into. The judge of the whole earth will do right, Genesis 18:25. I think we should rest content with the words of the Westminster Confession, which says that outside the church there's no ordinary possibility of salvation. Van Til and the Van Tillians. So let's bring this down to Van Til. In my view, the great contribution that Cornelius Van Til made was in the field of epistemology. He demonstrated that apart from presupposing the triune God of Scripture, it is not possible to make any coherent truth claims at all. In my reckoning, this is self-evident, and this is why I count myself among the Van Tillians. At the same time, I'm not well-versed enough in all of Van Til's works to say whether or not he dealt with the problem I see adequately, but I can say that a number of Van Tillians I've interacted with have fallen into a trap related to this. The trap consists of thinking that if a man cannot give a coherent account of his knowledge, then it must mean that he doesn't actually have that knowledge. But no, men know all kinds of things without knowing how they know. This is a place where I believe there's a lot of miscommunication between apologetic camps. Van Tillians often say that an unbeliever doesn't know something, when what they actually mean is that he cannot give an account of his knowing. So, in the light of all the foregoing, did Epimenides know God? Will we meet him in the resurrection? Comments are open on this one, so discuss among yourselves. As always, behave. The problem is that it is not possible to smash the foundation without also destroying the house. It is not possible to smash the patriarchy without also smashing everything that it was holding up. And as we look around at the demolition job that is occurring throughout our culture and the smoke that is rising up from the debris, the thought occurs to us that this may have been the point all along. Introduction. I trust that you've watched the NQN trailer 3 or 4 times now, and so you have noticed the line about apocalypse-proofing your family. The first step in learning how to do this is to learn how to quit doing the things that do not work at all. Well, correct that, actually. The first thing to do is to quit doing the things that are causing the problem, and then after that, to quit trotting out the solutions that don't work at all. One of the lame maneuvers is that of pretending that no apocalypse is happening, and hence there's no need to do anything. That works about as well as you might expect. The other is to recognize that there are in fact grave threats hurtling toward you and your family in the form of fireballs the size of grapefruit, and so you undertake to ward them off with a shield that you obtained for $19.95 from Joyce Meyer Ministries. That shield is made out of balsa wood and tissue paper, and in the insult to injury department, the tissue paper is pink. And far from slowing anything down, these shields just made the fireballs act a little happier somehow. The problem has been a dearth of biblical masculinity, and the solution is naturally going to require a restoration of biblical masculinity. More on this anon, as we boomers like to put it. Yea, verily, like a stick of cotton candy. The last few years was a stress test that a kindly providence applied to the approved evangelical leadership of North America, ALENA. And speaking of fireballs, the AELNA disappeared in one. This stress test consisted of a number of new and unique pressures, of the sort concerning which our seminaries of homiletical slickness had not offered any courses. And as we have now discovered, the ability to be glib and slick during the Q&A of whatever the heck conference it might have been turned out to be an ability that was of no use at all when it came to dealing with Donald Trump, Trump derangement syndrome, toxic slop from Wuhan, election rigging, the eager adoption of mandatory pathogen collectors for the face, the shutdown of our obviously non-essential worship services, and of course the obligatory vaccine for a population of docile pincushions. Watching the shepherds harangue the sheep about Romans 13 was like watching an 8th grade student council president pull rank on a 5th grader over a seat in the lunchroom, threatening to quote-unquote tell teacher. And watching the wolves deal with the shepherds was like watching someone take a blowtorch to a stick of cotton candy. The grace of crisis. One of the things that God does in history is to give us periodic foretastes of what will happen at the end of history. Recognized or not, all of us spend every day dealing with the permanent things right alongside the evanescent things. Because of our frailty, these categories can get a bit blurry for us, and we can sometimes forget which is which. One seems to blend into the other, and this is why God will regularly grant us the grace of a crisis. And when the grace is great, the crisis is great. What a crisis does is separate. It divides up the things that matter from the things that don't matter. It separates the eternal things, the permanent things, from the passing and temporal things. Our lives are surrounded every day with things that cannot be shaken and things that can be. And because we get in a muddle over it, God periodically grants us the grace of an earthquake. Quote, whose voice then shook the earth. But now he hath promised, saying, Yet once more I shake not the earth only, but also heaven. And this word, yet once more, signifieth the removing of those things that are shaken, as of things that are made, that those things which cannot be shaken may remain. Hebrews 12, 26 and 27. A storm is revelatory. A good storm is apocalyptic. The word apocalypse means an unveiling. The Latin equivalent is revelatio, from which we get our name for the book of Revelation. But what is revealed in a God-given crisis? Some think it is the pulling back of the curtain so that we can just see the cables and ropes backstage and the scenery waiting for Act 2. But I think it would be better to think of the unveiling as a manifestation of the difference between the marble pillars and the plaster ones. Quote, And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. Matthew 7, 25 and 27. The storm hit both houses hard, and it revealed the difference that true bedrock makes. All the extra money that was spent getting down to bedrock paid off, and that same amount of money that went into the curb appeal of the other house instead, well, that curb appeal is now kindling. The shutters had been a nice touch. That's one of them over there, over in the road next to the stop sign. We are warned about this form of grace in multiple places. It is almost as though God wanted Christian ministers to think about this a lot. Quote, Every man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire, and the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. If any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire. 1 Corinthians 3, 13 and 15. This passage is likely talking about the last day, but we should remember that God is a true master of foreshadowing. What he will do at the end of history, he has done many times throughout history. And if you and your ministry could not run with men, then how will you run with horses? Jeremiah 12:5. If your ministry could not withstand a bad case of the flu and a ginned up and stampeding panic, then how will your ministry do when the heavens are rolled back like a scroll and the mountains and islands are moved in their places? Quit you like men. And so, not only is biblical masculinity not the disease, it is the solution. God has determined that men should occupy the positions of leadership in each of the basic governments that he has established among men. These governments would be those of our civic life, Isaiah 3:12, our life together in the church, 1 Timothy 2:12, and in the family, 1 Corinthians 11:3. In the first place, he appointed men to take glad and sacrificial responsibility in these areas, and by men, I mean males. In addition to that, he required the males that he placed in these positions of authority and responsibility to act like men and not simply males. Quote, Watch ye, stand fast in the faith. Quit you like men, be strong. 1 Corinthians 16:13. When this is operating the way it ought to operate, the result is something called the patriarchy. That which, according to our soi-disant and lisping political theorists, must be smashed. Only they say something like thmath. The problem is that it is not possible to smash the foundation without also destroying the house. It is not possible to smash the patriarchy without also smashing everything that it was holding up. And as we look around at the demolition job that is occurring throughout our culture and the smoke that is rising up from the debris, the thought occurs to us that this may have been the point all along. One of the blessings that such biblical leadership provides is that of a masculine presence and authority when a crisis hits. And so that is what a lot of people are looking around for now. But there is a problem. Exile or desertion. In Christian circles, it has become customary to lament all the abdicating men. But it would be more accurate and sound more like real repentance if we acknowledge that the men who were willing to act like men have all been outlawed. Banished as they were, we didn't see much of them, and then we pretended that their absence was voluntary on their part. But the exiles were exiled and didn't go AWOL. They were not deserters. We could go to them and ask them to return. We could humble ourselves as the elders of Gilead did and plead with Jephthah to come back, Judges 11. They exiled him for reasons that seemed like a good idea to them at the time, but at least they had the good sense to realize that this is what they had done. They didn't hold seminars in the AELNA faculty lounge in order to puzzle over where Jephthah had gotten to. And so when they were confronted with the might of Ammon and the crisis they brought in with them, they were willing to go to the land of Tob to bring Jephthah back. American men can be invited back. They didn't shimmer off and evaporate. They are still around. But what will not work is to invite them back in order to play the role of cuckolds, capons, and cotqueans. They will not come back in order to serve as replacements or administrative assistants for the current crop of gamma males. They will not return in order to augment the ranks of little old ladies of both sexes. Men will always be dominant. in the very nature of the case. They are capable of being dominant in incredibly constructive ways, in ways that are a true marvel. But we, in the grip of a very peculiar frenzy that has a death grip on our little lizard brains, have decided to outlaw constructive dominance. This has opened the door for some men to resort to the dominance of criminal destructiveness, a thing which now exiled men used to prevent. It has also resulted in others taking the path of simply checking out, leaving, going into exile. But that is also destructive. When competent men leave, things start falling apart. What the sexual revolution and feminism did was to conduct a grand experiment on how long our culture could defer maintenance on, everything. The answer appears to be 60 years, give or take. But a handful of men, like Strider, became rangers in the North and decided to contribute constructively anyway, illegally and off budget. Don't tell anybody. Relentless giveaways. Here's what we propose to do. During the week of November 1st through 5th, you can get my ebook, The Covenant Household, free on Kindle. In addition, you can listen to the audiobook free on Canon Plus. And of course, you should stay notified of everything we're going to be giving away at noquarternovember.com. And if all that festivity were not enough, my little Mablog shop here is, for the duration of this very same week, giving away my book for kids called The Adventures of Fun Dad. In the realm of picture books, this one is my manga opus, so to speak. Blah Blah Black Sheep is now available for pre-order. What is Blah Blah Black Sheep, you may ask? A natural question, certainly. It is a book for astute children, written by my son Nate and illustrated by Forrest Dickinson. This is the famous duo of Hello Ninja fame. You know that show on Netflix? Blah Blah Black Sheep never does it right, according to the flock, but who do they call when danger's afoot? Get your copy today at blahblahkids.com. There are times when churches have become synagogues of Satan, and so it would not be a problem at all if a pious prince interfered with their misbegotten plans. But everything rides on what those plans actually are. If Guy Fawkes is plotting to blow up Parliament, then it is not a violation of his liberty of conscience to arrest and try him. We see in Scripture that there are three distinct governments among men that were established by God directly. The first was the government of the family, when God presented our first mother to Adam, Genesis 2:22 through 24, and the Apostle Paul delineates the hierarchical nature of that government for us, Ephesians 5:24, 1 Corinthians 11. The second government established by God is civil government, as Paul tells us, Romans 13:1 through 7, and the third government he established was the government of the church, Ephesians 4:8 through 13. These three governments were established directly by him, and so he writes the bylaws for them. He determines the legitimate jurisdictions of each and the range of their respective responsibilities. The family is supposed to be the ministry of health, education, and welfare. The civil government is the ministry of justice. The church is the ministry of word and sacrament. Other governments can be formed by men, of course, and as the creators, the founders of such governments get to write the bylaws for them. But these are lesser forms of social organization and do not conduct their business with any kind of divine sanction. They are lawful, certainly, but they do not come to us from the hand of God the way the others do. I'm talking here about the bylaws for your ham radio club, or the rules for a ladies' book group, or the expectations and standards for a signal group chat, like not allowing a journalist from the Atlantic. The challenge. All nice and tidy, right? The difficulty is that in the pursuit of their duties, these three governments have to relate to one another, and there are competing views on the nature of those interactions. Everything would be nice and tidy if everybody concerned was a Christian, and moreover, if everybody concerned were thinking and acting like Christians. Tall order, but there you go. I will address what our responsibility should look like when one or more of these governments is not cooperating and is misbehaving wildly. But the first thing to note is that the two entities of church and state are largely made up of households and depend upon them. This means that the necessity of figuring out what that relationship ought to be is not really optional. The fact that the church has authority over households does not mean that the elders can meet in session and then tell the Smiths what kind of car they can buy. They have authority, but not that authority. And the fact that the state has authority over households does not mean they have the authority to declare that two dudes can be husband and husband. They have authority, but not that authority. This means that one of our essential tasks in figuring out our social responsibilities is the task of figuring out how to keep the church and the state in their respective lanes when it comes to the family. And the problem goes the other way also. A father who administers the sacraments to his family is out of line, and a family man who declared war on Canada would be taking far too much upon himself and would probably lose anyhow. The challenge, one level up. And then one level up, we have the challenge of how to relate the church to the state and vice versa. And this is where most of our current confusions and controversies are located. There are three basic approaches to the relationship of church and state. The first would give the church the seniority, as was seen in the claims of the medieval papacy. The Pope was the vicar of Christ on earth, and, as such, he could require kings to submit to his will. If they crossed him, he could put that nation under an interdict, cutting off the flow of grace to all the sacraments in that nation, thus creating pressure on the king to comply. The second approach puts the church under the state, thus making one church an official department of the state, or placing all churches in a subordinate position. This approach has been called Erastianism, named after one Thomas Erastus, 1524 to 1583, who argued for it in the Reformation era. James White calls this and other related approaches sacralism. In Byzantium, it was called Caesaropapism. And because the modern secular state recognizes no real limits on its jurisdictional authority, the basic assumptions in modern society are Erastian in nature. This shows us that an Erastian civil government could be openly Christian, or it could be godless and secular. Say that in our time a local church excommunicated a woman for adultery and desertion of her family, and then she sued the session of the church for doing that. If a secular court took up the case, and if the suit proceeded, it could only do so on the supposition that the state was over the church. The third approach has been called the Kuyperian approach. This approach recognizes the lordship of Christ over all governments and gives each government the authority to pursue its responsibilities within the parameters set by Scripture. The family is to house and clothe its members. The civil government is to maintain order in the streets. The church is to preach the word and administer the sacraments. But these separate responsibilities are not being conducted in distinct or separated dimensions. They are all happening in the same world, and so they will all bump into each other, and at times their jurisdictional responsibilities will overlap. When that happens, responsible Christian men, guided by Scripture and natural prudence, need to work it out. And if the men in charge of one or more of these governments are godless men or immature Christian men, then there will be tests and challenges. Clashes and showdowns, my theological heroes. Now, I'm an advocate of this third approach. I think our starting point really needs to be Kuyperian. That does not mean that there will be no problems to work out, but I do want to start with the assumption that the family was directly commissioned by God, and so he defines the family. The civil magistrate was directly appointed by God to serve as a civic deacon, and so God is the one who establishes the moral necessity of limited government. And the church was established by God, with Christ as her head, and this means that she answers to him directly without state interference. Now, Stephen Wolfe likes to tease, and sometimes taunt, modern Reform guys for holding a view of church-state relations that is contrary to the view of their theological heroes. Well, yeah, of course. That is because my theological heroes did not maintain unbroken unanimity down through the centuries. Just imagine a panel discussion that included Augustine, Cranmer, and Warfield on pretty much any topic. And this is why Christ Church takes an exception to the original Westminster 23, which is our confession, on the civil magistrate, holding to a position that is midway between the original and the American revision of Westminster. The original Westminster Confession, 1646, really is conflicted on this point. It contains some strong Erastian elements, as well as some portions that try to lean against Erastianism. Again, Erastianism is the view that the state holds supremacy over the church, including ecclesiastical matters. As, for example, the magistrate, quote, hath power to call synods, to be present at them, and to provide that whatsoever is transacted in them be according to the mind of God. Westminster Confession of Faith 23:3. Now that is Erastian, straight up right there, and it was drafted and approved by my theological heroes. Always remembering that I agree with them on another point, which is that synods and councils err and have erred. Westminster Confession of Faith 31:4. But we also need to be fair. The original Westminster was a consensus document, and the assembly contained members who leaned Erastian and those who didn't, while at the same time an Erastian parliament, which had convened the assembly in the first place, was breathing down their neck. And this is why there are both elements in the confession. There was a strong sentiment in favor of the independence of the church among the Presbyterians, and there was also strong pressure from Parliament to, make them play ball. And so this is why there are other places that lean non-Erastian. For example, in Westminster Confession of Faith 31:1, it says when a synod has been called, it belongs to, quote, the ministers of Christ and other fit persons to decide issues of doctrine and discipline. This implies that such matters do not reside with the state, but rather the church. Another place that does not comport easily with Erastianism is the chapter on liberty of conscience, Westminster Confession of Faith 20.2, where it says that God alone is Lord of the conscience, and that when men contradict Scripture, there's real freedom from the doctrines and commandments of men. And the confession also defines the church as the kingdom of the Lord Jesus Christ, Westminster Confession of Faith 25.2, and asserts no other head of the church but the Lord Jesus Christ, Westminster Confession of Faith 25.6. This is why the American Presbyterians felt they needed to correct the original confession on this point. The American version says that civil authorities must not interfere in ecclesiastical affairs or favor one denomination of Christians over others. Yet, as nursing fathers, it is the duty of civil magistrates to protect the church of our common Lord without giving the preference to any denomination of Christians above the rest, in such a manner as all ecclesiastical persons whatever shall enjoy the full, free, and unquestioned liberty of discharging every part of their sacred functions without violence or danger. Westminster Confession of Faith 23.3, American version. Now, even though I would prefer a position a little less robust than the original and a little more robust than the American, it still needs to be said that the American Westminster is a Christian nationalist document. So if you are an American minister who subscribes to the Westminster, you need to believe that the magistrate should be solicitous for the churches of our common Lord and that he needs to avoid playing favorites between Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, and Episcopalians. Either that or you need to register your exception at Presbytery. One more thing. In a matter that is not exactly unrelated, a recent online scuffle has broken out over Joel Webbin's statement about the state needing to take wicked or apostate churches in hand while knocking a few heads in the process. But there's a deep structural problem with this take. This is either talking about now or it is talking about a hypothetical situation down the road without being given any of the variables. If it is talking about now, the picture is ludicrous, the pot declaring the kettle wicked and apostate and seizing all the kettle's assets. I know this mixes the metaphor, but we need to take risks if we're ever to learn anything new. The idea of any modern state in the current situation being competent to judge matters of doctrine or the spiritual health of churches is just laughable. But it doesn't improve any if we are talking about a hypothetical situation. It is like someone asking me what I would do if serious danger were to be coming right at me on this day next year. Which way would I jump, left or right? I have questions that would need to be answered first. What danger? How is it coming? Is it the kind of danger where jumping would help? And if the hypothetical situation is way out in the future, a century after massive Reformation revival, and our families are overwhelmingly in order, and Congress is crammed with Christians, there's some post-mill for you, and churches are orthodox and sound and vibrant, and the wolf has in fact made friends with the lamb, then I believe that all the governments involved are going to be in their own lanes, happily serving the Lord. The idea that under such conditions the state would be bossing the church around is simply wrong. That is not the future. As someone with Kuyperian convictions and as someone who is post-mill, I believe the future arrangement will be Kuyperian. The best formulation for all of this is something I learned from James Bannerman, which is that the state has authority in things circa sacra, around sacred things, but has no authority in sacris, in sacred things. But suppose the hypothetical situation down the road is dislocated. It is not the situation we have now, but it is really messed up in some way. Does the state get to step into ecclesiastical affairs then? Well, no, and sometimes yes, and I guess it depends. Where is it messed up? How? When Nathan corrected David over his adultery, that was the church correcting the state. When John the Baptist rebuked Herod over Herodias, that was the church correcting the state. When Jehoiada oversaw the coup that removed Athaliah, that was the church correcting the state. When Ambrose challenged Theodosius over his slaughter of the Thessalonians, that was the church correcting the state. But this is a fallen world, and there are times when it could go the other way. There are times when churches have become synagogues of Satan, and so it would not be a problem at all if a pious prince interfered with their misbegotten plans. But everything rides on what those plans actually are. If Guy Fawkes is plotting to blow up Parliament, then it is not a violation of his liberty of conscience to arrest and try him. So we cannot relate church and state in the abstract. If the conditions are post-mill good, then we can relate them peaceably, right out of the book. If they are tumultuous, then you need to describe the nature of the tumult, doing so in detail. And if the tumult is anything like what we have going on today, the church, with all her problems, has more wisdom to offer the state than the other direction. Of course, if Joe Biden, in this now manifest condition, is elected by all the rest of us in November, then the metaphor has descended upon America. America will be teetering around, yelling at clouds and rolling to a stop. Maybe, if that happens, and if we all pull together, coming together as one people, we can all of us finally beat Medicare. So this is what it is like, I mused to myself. The Visigoths battered down the gates, came in to have a look around, didn't think much of what they saw, and decided to head on home. I hear that Caligula made his horse a senator, and everybody thought it was hilarious. The civic souffle has collapsed, my friend. Putting it back in the oven for another 30 minutes will not accomplish what you are hoping it will. So here we are, living in a banana republic, and we don't even have the climate for growing bananas. So what is the rationale of our big think decision makers? Why are they now using plastic bananas? Everybody can see what it is now. And so here we are, staring at this disintegrating spectacle bug-eyed. I mean, everything is disintegrating except for the bananas, which are plastic. Not much that we can do about any of this at present, but maybe we can walk around and have a look-see. Maybe we can ponder a bit. Some of the most important and best connected people in the world, people who work day to day with Joe Biden and who therefore knew what kind of shape he was in, decided for some reason that it would be a bright idea to put him on one of the biggest stages in the world, making sure to get millions of sets of eyes on that man in order that the top doctors involved could retest the half-life of whatever meds they had used to get him all amped up for the State of the Union. It turns out they miscalculated. The half-life is now actually something like 6 minutes. As long as we are out there arresting our political opponents, perhaps it is time for us to place a call to Adult Protective Services in order to ask them to open a file on Joe Biden. One post-debate poll indicated that 67% believe that Trump won the debate, while 33% believe that Biden won the debate. Now, of course, those numbers spell electoral disaster for all the Biden operatives analyzing them, but that is just the obvious political angle. But there's another calamity lurking in those numbers. What is it like for you, mon petit frère, living at a time when a third of the people out there think that Biden won that debate? I mean, they just whizzed past you on the freeway, and why aren't more people dying? I don't think that Biden needs to take a cognitive test because I think all the sensible people know by now. But perhaps that 33% needs to take a cognitive test. If Joe Biden is anything to go by, it appears that the boomers are going to be ardent disciples of Dylan Thomas and will not go gentle into that good night. Rage, she maintains, rage against the dying of the light. You answered every question, she declared, with the air of a diligent mother potty training a toddler, being sure to lead with the affirmation. Affirmation is so important in these things. One obvious theory is that the Democratic bigwigs decided it was time for Joe to go, and so they orchestrated this as the big unveiling, the big reveal. And sure enough, it was as though a signal had been given, because the next day there was a chorus of leftist voices saying that they loved Joe, but it was time for him to step aside for the good of the nation. Everything seemed arranged. The debate was quite early, so there would be time for a switcheroo and so on. But if they were being all that clever, it was too clever by half. They needed way more than time. Obama tweeted that it was a bad night, but signaled continued support, and so that quelled the out-in-public panic, sort of. And then the White House announced the next day that Joe wasn't going anywhere, and him voluntarily stepping aside is about the only way this could happen. The DNC had changed the rules after the last round in order to squeeze out primary challenges, and so if Joe stays in it to win it, his delegates are bound. They are also bound, if Joe goes, to hand the keys over to Kamala. So removing Joe without Jill's cooperation would be a complicated maneuver, given the fact that the election is run by the states, all 50 of them, with different rules, requirements, deadlines, and such. It is more likely an impossible maneuver. There are good arguments for saying that if they remove Biden from the ballot in 3 swing states, Georgia, Nevada, and Wisconsin, he could not be replaced by anyone else on the ballot. This is quite a corner they all painted themselves into, and all of it was done by smart people. Even if we pose an out-there thought experiment with some really bad actors on that side who would be willing to cut the Gordian knot via assassination, that still just gets them Kamala. And if they took out Joe and Kamala, that gets them Mike Johnson. And if Biden were to die of natural causes, they still get Kamala. Keep in mind that Jill might have all sorts of reasons unrelated to personal vanity or a love of state dinners for refusing to go. As long as Joe is president, he has pardoning power. The egregious use of lawfare aimed at Trump destroyed the cultural precedent and expectation that the courts would not be used on political opponents, and they destroyed that precedent with some cooked-up charges against Trump. What position does this leave the Biden family crime syndicate in? Does anyone believe that there are no actual Biden crimes and offenses when it comes to, say, Ukraine? Of course, the cabinet could assemble and invoke the 25th Amendment of the Constitution, thus removing Joe Biden as the incumbent. The problem is that this leaves them with Kamala, and Kamala in her prime makes the same kind of sense as does Biden in his dotage. The only upside would be that the incoherence would be coming from a person of color, although this does seem to me like a weird application of affirmative action. About the only way I can think of that they could do this, since they are the party of lawlessness, is to just do it anyway, and then brazen it out by calling electoral deadlines white supremacy. Anyone who raised questions would clearly be a racist. This would be sort of a casino heist nomination, and it would certainly drive the ratings up. Late summer promises to be pretty gaudy, and the Democratic convention was already going to have riots. So the word I've heard most often since the debacle on Thursday night is the word panic. Democratic operatives are in a flop sweat panic. But the reality of this panic, and it is very real, is not just because there is now the real prospect of losing an election. That is in the mix, sure, but a lot more is involved. Our ruling elites for the longest time have enjoyed the sensation of always being the smartest ones in the room. One thinks of Thomas Sowell's great subtitle for his vision of the anointed, self-congratulation as a basis for social policy. Now, if a wise person started to feel like he was always the smartest person in the room, what he should do is go and find a different room. But these elites enjoyed that particular sensation. It was warm and cozy, gave them an overall glow, and it was consistent with the flattering education that had wafted them up through the Ivies and into high-paying jobs inside the Beltway. So the panic is not settling in because they are being exposed as those who might lose an election. That has happened to plenty of people. What is happening is this. They are in the process of losing an entire oligarchy. They have swathed themselves in self-congratulatory lies for so long, not admitting any evidence to the contrary, canceling out the voices of any possible critics, such that their looming exposure is going to be total. They are going to be exposed as petty, conniving, stupid, moronic, mendacious, corrupt, purblind, conceited, proud, and completely and entirely out of their depth. They will be revealed as elites who are not elite at all. Ruling elites need to be much more than well-connected mediocrities and highly credentialed midwits. Hence the panic. The first tier is going to be exposed as liars who knew that they were lying, and the second tier are going to be exposed as liars who ought to have known they were being lied to by the first tier. They thought they were in the first tier, but apparently not. The true inner circle were those administering the meds and holding the wires. The thing that is astonishing right now is how astonished the second-tier people are acting. Consequently, there's a good deal of anger in the second tier as well, anger aimed at the White House insiders who knew all along. But out here in the hinterlands, we have known that Joe Biden was cognitively impaired for years now, and yet here we are, watching the television where people who have actually met him are slapping their foreheads and exclaiming, "Who could have anticipated this turn of events?" So the metaphor descends. The Democrats have chosen their titular leader. They have selected their man. He is their representative, and what he is doing encapsulates what they are also doing. What he does, they do. He teeters out on stage, and they have also teetered out on stage. He yells at a cloud, they yell at a cloud. He mumbles his way to a midway point in the sentence, rolls to a stop, and they do exactly the same. So at the end of the day, there's nothing left for any of the Democrats to do except finally beat Medicare. Of course, if Joe Biden, in this now manifest condition, is elected by all the rest of us in November, then the metaphor has descended upon America. America will be teetering around, yelling at clouds and rolling to a stop. Maybe, if that happens, and if we all pull together, coming together as one people, we can all of us finally beat Medicare. So now, if Joe Biden wins in November, fair and square, we will then have to argue that America deserves to catch it in the teeth, good and hard. And if Joe Biden wins in November by hook, crook, monkey shines, and shenanigans, like last time, only even more open, and we quietly accept that, then again, we will deserve everything that will in fact be coming our way. Greetings all. My name is Douglas Wilson, the host of Man Rampant. Man Rampant is officially back with a new season on Canon Plus. This coming season features episodes on fighting abortion in your state, the Christian artist, and how if you're not paranoid, you're crazy. We hope you enjoy it, and if you can't bring yourself to enjoy it, we at least hope you can stare at the screen bug-eyed.